Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Augustine Choi, Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine, and I'm pleased to bring you an important edition of our Weill Cornell Medicine Insights webinar series. As many of you know, we launched Insights just over a year ago at the height of the pandemic to keep all of us connected and informed. Now, a year later, vaccines have led to great progress and promise against COVID, saving thousands of lives. With the CDC now recommending vaccine booster shots for certain high-risk groups, we felt it was important to share with you today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccines, the latest science and recommendations on booster shots. We are fortunate to have two of Weill Cornell's top infectious disease experts joining us for this important conversation, Doctors Trip Gulick and Kristen Marks. And we are pleased that our Director of Primary Care, Dr. Adam Stracker, will be serving as a moderator. Thank you very much again for joining us today and for being part of the Weill Cornell Medicine family. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Stracker to get things started. And thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Augustine Choi, Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine, and I'm pleased to bring you an important edition of our Weill Cornell Medicine Insights webinar series. As many of you know, we launched Insights just over a year ago at the height of the pandemic to keep all of us connected and informed. Now, a year later, vaccines have led to great progress and promise against COVID, saving thousands of lives. With the CDC now recommending vaccine booster shots for certain high-risk groups, we felt it was important to share with you today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccines, the latest science and recommendations on booster shots. We are fortunate to have two of Weill Cornell's top infectious disease experts joining us for this important conversation, Doctors Trip Gulick and Kristen Marks. And we are pleased that our Director of Primary Care, Dr. Adam Stracker, will be serving as a moderator. Thank you very much again for joining us today and for being part of the Weill Cornell Medicine family. Dr. Stracker, now I'll turn it over to Dr. Stracker to get things started.
Great. Thank you, Dean Choi. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Weill Cornell Medicine, I am pleased to welcome you to our seminar, COVID-19 Vaccines, the latest science and recommendations on booster shots. As Dr. Choi said, I'm Dr. Adam Stracker, Chief Medical Officer and Director of Primary Care for the Weill Cornell Physician Organization and Associate Dean of Clinical Affairs at Weill Cornell Medicine. We are joined today by two experts, Dr. Roy Gulick, who is Chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases and the Rochelle Belfer Professor in Medicine. Dr. Gulick is co-chair of the National Institute of Health's COVID-19 Treatment Guidelines Panel and is an internationally recognized leader in clinical research for infectious diseases and HIV. And Dr. Kristen Marks, Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases. Dr. Marks recently led Weill Cornell Medicine's clinical trials of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. We've made so much progress against COVID-19 since vaccines became available in the United States earlier this year. But with the spread of the Delta variant and studies demonstrating that the protection afforded by COVID-19 vaccines may wane over time, public health officials are now suggesting that an additional vaccine dose may strengthen the immune response to the virus. Currently, the CDC is recommending that people who are 65 and over and anyone who is 18 to 64 with certain underlying medical conditions get a booster dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine 6 months after their last shot. Frontline healthcare workers and teachers may also benefit. We'll also touch on the hot off the press information about the Moderna vaccine. today. The Johnson & Johnson booster shots information is expected soon, with guidance from the CDC perhaps as soon as tomorrow, or from the FDA perhaps as soon as tomorrow. With so much information out there, we're faced with many questions about waning immunity, the importance of booster shots, and ways in which people can best protect themselves from both infection and serious disease. So today, we will start by talking about the current CDC guidelines for booster shots, and then we'll get into the science behind the vaccines. We will begin today's webinar with a discussion with Drs. Gulick and Marks for about 40 minutes. We'll then open the floor for you to ask questions. So please write them down or remember them as we go along, and then be prepared to submit them to us via the chat feature, which will be turned on at after about 40 minutes in the Q&A section. Great. So I hope everyone's ready. We are going to talk first about who needs booster shots. So Dr. Gulick, can you tell us who is currently eligible for the COVID-19 booster shots, and a little bit about the rationale behind the groups that are recommended, the scientific rationale?
Sure, happy to. The boosters are indicated to provoke additional immune responses. That is, to make sure that the vaccines keep protecting against COVID infection and the complications of COVID infection, including severe COVID, which could be hospitalization and or more intensive care. So what we've come to know first is that certain groups of patients don't respond as well to vaccines as the general population. And in particular, those are the groups who have moderate to severe immunocompromise, meaning that their immune system is not working as well as other people in the population. So who has immunocompromise? It's estimated about 3% of the population has either an immunocompromising condition, which could be something like cancer or HIV infection or other kinds of autoimmune diseases, or they're taking medications which dampen the immune system's function. So people who take corticosteroids for a number of reasons, or are on cancer chemotherapy. So we know from pretty good studies that those groups don't respond as well to the standard doses of vaccines. And these were the first people who were recommended for an additional booster dose. And that included both the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. We don't actually know about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Then there became this appreciation, as you began to discuss, that even in healthy people, the immune response from a vaccine could decrease or wane over time. And at the same time, as we've all come to know, the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, has become the predominant variant in the United States and actually across the world. In fact, the latest data show that 100% of new infections are caused by the Delta variant. So there is some preliminary information to tell us that immune responses may decrease after a period of months, and that the immune responses from the original vaccines may not be quite as strong against the Delta variant. So what that's done in terms of the information we have today is led the FDA and then backed by the CDC to suggest that people that got the Pfizer vaccine first, so 2 doses of Pfizer, that certain groups in the population would benefit from a 3rd dose of the Pfizer vaccine. That is, that 3rd dose would stimulate the immune system again. And Adam, you just reviewed the groups that may apply to. So people over the age of 65, people between 18 and 64 who have underlying medical conditions, or work in settings where they may be repeatedly exposed to COVID, like healthcare settings or schools. And then as we heard today, just today, we have additional information for the Moderna vaccine, which Dr. Marks probably would like to review for us.
Great. Well, I'm going to get to her. Thank you very much, Dr. Gulick. Dr. Marks, so as you know, and as we've all seen, the messaging around booster shots has evolved over time, which has created some confusion. In August, the federal government said that everyone 18 and older should receive a third COVID mRNA vaccine dose after 8 months. But now the FDA and the CDC's booster guidance suggests that a more limited number of people would benefit from the booster dose. What is the science behind that shift in recommendation?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So first, I just want to emphasize that the most important vaccine doses are the initial doses, and that with boosters, we may see sort of an incremental benefit, but really you get the most protection from those original, in the case of the mRNA vaccines, 2 shots. But as we started to see variants of concern and different variants of the virus, it did become clear that there were some vaccine breakthroughs, as were to be expected. But once Delta began circulating at a large rate, the breakthrough cases were seen more commonly. And so for that reason, I think there was the acceleration of interest in boosters and whether boosters would help protect against Delta specifically. But fortunately, as more data has accumulated and we've tracked the trend, it's clear that the vaccines are protecting most people from severe disease. So most age groups, even with just the 2 doses, do not get the severe pneumonias. They don't end up hospitalized or in intensive care, as Dr. Gulick mentioned. However, there are some age groups or people with conditions where there's a higher level of protection feels warranted. So if there's something we can do to boost immunity against the Delta variant, the FDA determined that the benefits clearly would outweigh the risks for giving a booster dose. So fortunately, we haven't seen excess risk from booster doses, but it was more sort of the lack of information. I think the FDA wanted to see more before they made a recommendation for a group that may not benefit as much. And that's why they kind of came up with these, the age cutoff, as well as the different comorbid conditions to focus on in terms of who should get a booster right now. Now that may change over time. And they may broaden it as there's more data about the use of the vaccine in other age groups.
Great. Thank you.
Adam, maybe
Yes.
I could just chime in and say that one really important thing that people should know is that this is a rapidly changing area. And we hear something, but then we get additional data or more information, and we modify our recommendations. That's how medicine works. We want to make the most up-to-date recommendations we can based on the data we have. And one important thing about boosters was a very large question: were they safe? Originally, we only had data on several hundred people. More recently, we have data on tens of thousands of people to show that they, as Dr. Mark said, boosters are safe with the Pfizer vaccine. People are asking, well, why don't we know about Moderna yet? And why don't we know about Johnson & Johnson? And the fact is that the information was still being put together. And so that explains why things may change over time and recommendations change. We're responding to the science and to the medicine of it.
That's a really important point. It's not that we don't know what we're doing. It's that this is a new disease and we're just collecting more data and making recommendations as we collect it. So great. Thank you for that point. So Trip, to you. So are there considerations beyond the CDC's designated categories of booster doses? For example, what if you live with someone who isn't eligible for vaccination, like a child under 12, or you live in a community with low rates of vaccination overall? Should you get a booster dose in that setting?
I think we need to follow what the federal guidelines are today because it's based on the information. So I would say if you're in one of the groups that we just mentioned, either over 65, everybody over 65 is now eligible for a booster with Pfizer. And I'll just spill the beans and say today the FDA is also recommending Moderna in that setting. So a Moderna booster if you got the Moderna vaccine. And then anyone from age 18 to 64 with an underlying medical condition or who is in a setting where they're repeatedly exposed is eligible for a booster. I don't think we want to recommend more broadly to other populations. And the reason I'm saying that is because we simply don't have the information we need to make that recommendation. Maybe we will over time. In fact, almost certainly we will over time.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Marks, what about people who have had COVID-19 already? Should they receive a booster shot, and why?
So drawing off the initial experience with giving vaccines to protect against COVID, we know that they can safely be given to people who have a history of COVID. We have less experience giving booster doses. So I think this recommendation I'd probably make on a more case-by-case basis, that if people had a very recent COVID infection, they certainly should wait until their symptoms have resolved and, potentially up to a couple months, usually around the 3-month point we recommend is when we can see some of the natural immunity wearing off. So I think that would be a reasonable time to get a booster. But in essence, they've sort of had a boost naturally by, unfortunately acquiring the infection. So I don't think it's as urgent for people who've had COVID after having a full vaccination series to get a boost. Now, if they were an immunocompromised person, that may be, that would influence the timing. And I think, once their symptoms had resolved, if they wanted a booster, I would say go ahead with it.
Okay. But just to clarify, if they had COVID a year ago and then they received this series of vaccinations and they fall into one of those categories that are eligible, they should still get a booster at this point, or that would be the recommendation if they're over 65 or immunocompromised. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So then one more difficult question for you. What's the role of antibody testing here to illuminate whether someone should get a third dose or not?
Right. So it's not recommended to test antibodies to make decisions about vaccination. And that's for a few reasons. So first of all, there's just different types of antibodies. So the antibodies that the vaccine produces are the spike antibodies. So if you're having your antibodies to the spike protein, that's the protein that the vaccine makes an immune response to. So if someone's having antibodies checked to even look at vaccine response, you want to make sure, first of all, it's that antibody. But it's not recommended because we don't know a threshold level that confers protection, because within the antibodies that are measured, there's different types of antibodies. There's sort of neutralizing antibodies, which are very important in initially warding off infection. And then there's other types of antibodies as well, which likely play an important role in the immune response, but don't necessarily, confer complete protection. So once we have a level where we know we can safely say, this antibody level is protective, that recommendation may change. But from the studies that have been done so far, there's not a sort of a clear threshold. It's more complicated than that. So it's kind of a test that ends up not being that useful. So it's better to just decide based on, are you in one of those groups where booster is recommended, and to boost on that basis.
Great. Thank you. So Dr. Gulick, as you know, now is the time of year when we also need to be thinking about the flu and about our influenza vaccination. So is there any recommendation around timing of the booster and the flu vaccine?
Yes, there is. We used to say that you needed to separate the COVID-19 vaccine from all other vaccines. But again, as more information has become available, we now know that it's safe to administer the vaccines close together. You do not need to wait any time at all. In fact, they can be given at the same time. And you're right to point out that people are concerned that this year could be a particularly bad year for the flu. Part of that is due to the fact that yet last year was such a mild year for the flu. So I would urge that everybody get the influenza vaccine this year, and it shouldn't interfere at all with getting a booster dose or the original dose if you haven't been vaccinated yet for COVID-19. Please get both.
Great. Good advice. Thank you. Okay, so let's delve a little bit more into the science behind the boosters and the recommendations. So Dr. Marks, when do we expect to see the study results and recommendations for younger children?
So there's been some limited data released about the response to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in children ages 5 to 11. And it looks promising that a very good immune response can be achieved within actually a smaller dose of the vaccine. And that has been submitted to the FDA. And I believe we'll hear more by the end of the month on whether, whether it will be moved forward for emergency use authorization. The Moderna vaccine, we've seen data on adolescents. And I think the other, studies are ongoing as well. And the FDA also hasn't weighed in on the approval of Moderna for adolescents yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Dr. Gulick, before today, I might have asked, when are we going to get information on the Moderna booster recommendation? But I will ask you, do we know anything about when we should hear about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? And why is this different? Why are the recommendations different for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine than for Pfizer? Why can't we just say, well, if you need a booster for one, you need a booster for the other?
It's a good question, and it's really based on the information we have. So Pfizer was the first vaccine to be developed. And as most people know, it was the first and only vaccine right now to be FDA approved. Moderna came next, and as most people know, is currently available by emergency use authorization, and all the data is at the FDA undergoing review for full approval. The third vaccine in line was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, Johnson & Johnson is different from the other two. The first two are known as mRNA vaccines. They take a little slice of the RNA, the genetic material of the virus that causes COVID-19, and use that as part of the vaccine. What's different about Johnson & Johnson are two things. They use a harmless virus to put that viral gene in, known as an adenovirus. So it's a fundamentally different way of doing it, although it achieves the same response. That is, the immune system reacts and makes a healthy response to it. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, in contrast to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, only requires a single dose. And because it became later in time, the information we have is evolving. So we just mentioned that today was the day that the FDA met to talk about boosters for Moderna. Tomorrow is the day that the FDA is talking about boosters for the J&J vaccine. And then following both these meetings later this month will be the Center for Disease Control meetings, who will take the next step and advise whether this is authorized. What we know so far is that the FDA is suggesting boosters for the two groups that were suggested for the Pfizer vaccine. And again, that's based on data. We'll have to wait till tomorrow to find out what the recommendations for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine might be.
Great. So along those lines, can you explain a little bit more about what these booster doses actually do to the immune system and how this works and what it's been shown to do?
Sure. So the vaccine itself, either the Pfizer or the Moderna, takes a small snip of the genes from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, encases it in a fat globule, and that's the vaccine. So that gets injected into your arm, and then that genetic material, that little snip of the RNA, the genes, finds its way into a cell and then is used as a template by the cell to make that spike protein that Dr. Marks mentioned. Now, you've seen the diagram of the coronavirus. It has all these little things on the surface of it, and those are known as the spikes of the virus or the spike protein. Because that's on the outside of the virus, that's what the immune system recognizes and says, oh, foreign protein, I need to make a response. So it makes antibodies and cells which try to neutralize the virus. What the vaccine does is put that spike protein. So now your own muscle cells and other cells are making that spike protein, only the spike protein, not the other parts of the virus. So the immune system sees that protein and makes the very same antibodies and cells. So you now have those antibodies and cells on board after being vaccinated. And then if you should ever come into contact with the virus, your immune system has already primed a response to neutralize that virus. And that's how the two vaccines work, Pfizer and Moderna. They do it slightly differently, but with the same general concept. Johnson & Johnson, as I mentioned, uses a harmless virus called an adenovirus, puts that gene inside that virus, and that's the vaccine. So that gets injected into your arm. The virus finds its way to the cell, but that adenovirus can't reproduce itself, delivers that RNA or the genetic material inside the cells again. They make spike protein and primes the immune system to make the response. So the end result is the same with all three of the vaccines, and actually all of the other COVID vaccines that are available worldwide. They prime the immune system to make a response to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And then if you get infected with the virus, that response should prevent serious infection from happening, or perhaps even any infection at all.
And then the purpose of the booster is just literally to just increase the number of antibodies you're developing. And is that why the booster works and makes it a better efficacy?
So the booster is then provoking the immune system again. It's giving you that spike protein again. The immune system recognizes it and enhances the production of antibodies, which are made by cells in the body called B cells. So all those cells are already there, but then they start making more antibody. And then the other cells that are going to respond to this virus are also primed again. So the level of response of the immune system is stimulated by those booster shots.
Great. So Dr. Marks, is there a danger in getting too many boosters? Could this have a negative impact on the immune system in some way?
With the current booster, certainly not. And I don't see any real risk of that. I mean, I don't recommend people get multiple boosters right now, but if down the line we need to get additional shots, I don't see a downside. The current, we know from the data available that, as Dr. Gulick mentioned earlier, the antibody levels wane, particularly those neutralizing antibodies, which are the first line of defense. We have other defense mechanisms in our immune system. That's sort of the first line. So giving the boost now when Delta's circulating widely makes sense to kind of enhance the defense against Delta. And over time, we don't know how quickly the antibody levels that are made from the booster will wane. It may be necessary down the road to give additional boosters. The virus may evolve enough that we need to give a different type of booster to cover a newer strain. But for right now, one booster certainly has no negative effect on the immune system, and it definitely raises antibody levels and primes those other cells, as Dr. Gulick said.
Great. So you mentioned,
Adam,
sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that there was a theoretical risk that if you keep stimulating the immune system, perhaps you could cause inflammation or even what are known as autoimmune reactions, where the immune system actually turns on the body and can cause problems. But that theoretical concern has not been seen in any of the studies of the boosters that are available so far. So as I mentioned earlier, Initially, that was only in several dozen patients and then several hundred, and now we've seen it in tens of thousands of people. So it's reassuring that we are not seeing complications of inflammation or increased risk of any of the other side effects that people get. The side effects from the booster tend to be very similar to the side effects people got from shots 1 and 2. So local pain in the arm, and then maybe a day or two of feeling muscle aches and pains, fatigue, or fever in a small number of people. And that all resolves. So we're reassured by the data. Whether people got a bunch of additional boosters, I mean, nobody's recommending that right now.
Yeah, great. Dr. Marks, you mentioned briefly the idea about variant-specific vaccinations or changes to the formula. So is that something that is being worked on or being considered at this point?
Yes, it is being studied. However, kind of with the reason that didn't move forward for this current boost is because they compared actually using some of the variant strains that were available to the original strain. And fortunately, the original strain created a boost at the level that was needed even for strains like Delta. So given there was a lot more experience with using the original vaccine, that was the decision was made for both Pfizer and Moderna to utilize that rather than a variant booster.
Okay, great. And Trip, a difficult question for you. Do we expect that this SARS-CoV-2 virus will stay with us for a long time, or do we think it may disappear like other pandemic viruses have? What's the current thought about that?
Most people think because of the tens of millions of people who've now been infected, that this virus is likely to stay with us for a while, perhaps even become a seasonal virus like the flu or the common cold viruses. So I think many people think that COVID-19 will be here with us. It reminds us just another reason why everyone should get vaccinated. And people should get their boosters if they're eligible to get them.
Great. So let's touch briefly on the concept of mixing vaccines. Dr. Marks, a clinical trial is examining whether using different vaccines for the third shot might be better than getting a third dose of the same vaccine. When might we know the results, and what's the theory behind that?
So the NIH actually released the results of their study on this Wednesday, although it hasn't been yet peer reviewed. And so, I think it's kind of preliminary in that nature. But the theory, was, will these different strategies for delivering the vaccine, will giving them in a certain order have more beneficial effects than just kind of giving the same series? And they tested kind of giving the same, giving different, and both were very successful at boosting. There was a enhanced boost, at least in terms of antibody levels, when J&J was followed by an mRNA vaccine. So, I don't know how that will influence the recommendations around what booster to give. We don't yet know for the J&J vaccine, but I think my interpretation of the data is any booster is likely to add to your antibody level, and people should get the vaccine that they're most comfortable with in terms of boosting. I don't think there's a real downside to either of them. And I think, certain age groups, we kind of in terms of like young men versus older women, some people have preferences based on the risk profile of the vaccines for particular age groups. And I think people should pick the one they're most comfortable with. But we'll see what the recommendations, we'll see, kind of as this data, like I said, is peer reviewed and finalized, and what recommendations the CDC's Committee on Vaccines, which is the ACIP, what they make. And I would follow that.
Great. Thanks. So Trip, to that question, as many people may know, some of the Scandinavian countries have stopped giving the Moderna vaccine to younger people. And there's been some concern about myocarditis and pericarditis. will there be a recommendation, or is it possible there'll be a recommendation that people who got Moderna first, if they're in that age group, should get a Pfizer booster? Is that a thought, or what's the feeling right now about using that in younger, especially younger men?
So myocarditis is the medical term for inflammation of the heart muscle, and pericarditis is the medical term for inflammation around the heart, the lining of the heart, outer lining. And this is a known rare side effect of the mRNA viruses. Both Pfizer and Moderna have been associated. It turns out the people most likely to get myocarditis are young men, so adolescent or young adult men. And we don't know how common this is. It's estimated somewhere between 1 in 5,000 and 1 in 100,000. What does that mean? It means that the vaccine is causing inflammation in the heart, which can present with chest pains and other types of symptoms in young men. The good news is that most of these people that develop myocarditis completely recover and do fine. And it's often just a really mild illness. So we're learning more about myocarditis. The federal authorities looked at all the information and have come out and said that the risk of myocarditis is far less than the risk of not getting the vaccine. So they do recommend getting the COVID vaccines, even in young men. The other thing to remember is that COVID itself can cause myocarditis and pericarditis. It's actually much more frequent as a complication of the disease than it is of the vaccinations.
Great, thank you. Okay, in our final couple minutes, let's talk a little bit about illness prevention and breakthrough infections. So to Dr. Gulick, so obviously we know about breakthrough infections. So some people who are vaccinated are still getting infected and getting ill, usually mild, but sometimes serious. Was this expected?
So no vaccine is perfect. These COVID vaccines actually work better than many of the other vaccines that we routinely recommend and that many people have gotten. So I don't think it was any big surprise that we would see some breakthrough infections. The good news about breakthrough infections is that they are almost always mild. So people will get upper respiratory type symptoms, maybe runny nose, a cough, but self-limited and goes away within a couple of days. It's unusual that anyone needs to be hospitalized for a breakthrough infection. So something like less than 5% of people who are hospitalized right now for COVID-19 are vaccinated. Or said another way, 95% of people who are hospitalized right now for COVID are unvaccinated. And then very few go on to develop, to need to be put on a respirator or die. These would be very, very unusual complications of breakthrough infections. So short answer, yes, we did expect breakthrough infections and we are seeing them, but it almost always is a mild, very self-limited infection.
Great. And then last question, I think, before we'll open up the Q&A to Dr. Marks. Do we still need to wear masks indoors? As more and more people are getting vaccinated, many of our friends and families are asking why they need to wear masks indoors. So could you tell us why or whether we will need to continue to do that?
Right. So I think, this comes down to kind of how much virus is circulating. And so how likely you are to be exposed and what the vaccination rate is in your community as well. Because we know, having the vaccine will give you that higher level of protection. And when your neutralizing antibodies are high, hopefully you won't get infected at all. But if they, drop, you may get an infection, but it'll be more self-limited as your immune system kicks in and fights it off. But in that short time, you can, potentially spread the infection. And if there's a lot of virus circulating, we know masks can help prevent the spread. So I think in the very short term, while Delta is, raging, masks indoors make a lot of sense. We're coming into winter. We want it to be a good winter. We want to keep our ICUs open for the medical problems other than COVID. And I think because, my advice would be to continue to wear the masks indoors and to encourage unvaccinated people to get vaccinated. I think that's where we can make the big difference and hopefully get to a mask-free point.
Great. So there is that hope that if more people get vaccinated, as we all want them to, we can get to a point where we can go back to maskless indoor gatherings.
Right.
Great. So before we go to the questions, the last minute or so, Drs. Gulick or Dr. Marks, anything else about boosters that we didn't cover that you think the public should know that I didn't ask you?
I think one thing to not be surprised about in terms of the Moderna vaccine is the booster is going to be kind of a half of the original dose, just so people know. That's by design. That was studied and compared the full strength versus the half dose. Whether that will have a benefit in terms of, we don't know much about the risk of myocarditis with the booster dose in young men because we're starting to see experience in Israel with the Pfizer vaccine. But like Trip mentioned, only we're in the tens of thousands of people vaccinated. And if the risk is 1 in 100,000, right, it takes hundreds of thousands of people to really understand that risk for that age group. So, but hopefully, reducing the dose may help decrease the risk of that as well.
Great. All right, excellent. So the chat is open now, and I'm going to read off some questions from our audience, and I'll just we'll alternate here. So Trip, because of the apparent superiority of the Moderna vaccine over time from a recent New England Journal study, would it at least make theoretic sense to get a booster of Moderna if you had gotten the first 2 shots of Pfizer?
Current recommendations are that you get the booster with the same vaccine that you received the first time. And remember, we're recommending a booster here to enhance the immune response. We know that it will increase the level of antibodies and cells that can fight the virus. So the reason I say that is there is limited experience. Christy reviewed some of this with mixing the vaccines. And so I would be more comfortable with more safety information before we started recommending mixing vaccines at this time. People should stick with the same one they got the first time for now.
Great, thank you. What about people who got the Novavax or AstraZeneca, the people who are in the trials? What should they do in terms of boosters right now? Dr. Marks?
Right. So with AstraZeneca, there is some data on sort of the mixing and matching of vaccines and with mRNA vaccines after. So I think it's a reasonable approach. For Novavax, we'll hear later this week, but I think the intention is to study a booster in the ongoing Novavax study. So that vaccine is not available to general public right now. It's only available in clinical trials. So I think those would have to be handled sort of on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, great. So I think to Dr. Gulick, because this was something you had mentioned, if you are a vaccinated young male, is the risk of heart inflammation from a booster more or less than getting mild COVID breakthrough? Basically, what would you recommend to someone who is a young male who, whether they should get a booster or not?
So we don't know is the easy answer to that question because we simply don't have the data. But a young man who's recommended for the booster, at least according to what we know, either has an underlying condition which increases their risk of COVID, so it would be indicated there, or works in a setting where they are frequently exposed to COVID. So again, both of those scenarios, I would suggest getting a booster. And remember that the myocarditis is infrequent or rare complication.
Okay, great, thank you. Just a couple quick questions about why the recommendations for boosters were chosen at the age. So in Israel, they're giving 60 plus. Here we suggested 65. And is asthma a condition for a booster? So I know that's two questions in one, but Dr. Gulick, maybe you could take those.
Sure.
Why did we choose 65 and Israel chose 60?
The short answer is I don't know, but the explanation is that the risk for severe COVID increases with every additional decade of life as you're an adult. So the highest risk for severe COVID in adults is adults over the age of 85. And if you look at all risk factors across the board, that is one of the highest risk groups. So I think whether it's 60 or 65, I think the message is the same, that older adults will benefit from a booster shot to make sure that they don't get COVID infection.
And I will say Israel expanded their recommendations on boosters to include all adults. So, it's a source of additional information. Now their safety data, because they did it sort of over time, they lowered the age of who could get a booster. So the groups we have the least experience on are the youngest adults, but there will be, over time, more information about booster safety coming from Israel. It's been a really great source of information, and because they chose to have this aggressive strategy with boosters based on their own outbreak dynamics, where they were seeing excess hospitalizations in older people primarily, but also starting to see it in younger people. So they chose to expand the booster age range.
Great. A question here to either one of you about long-term risks. There's been a lot about, well, I know the vaccine is safe now, but what about years from now? And someone poses a question here about, could the lipid particles cross the blood-brain barrier and cause disease many years later? So what do you say, Trip, first, I guess, about that and about the concern about, unknown long-term side effects of the vaccination?
We should be reassured that all the vaccines that came before these current COVID vaccines, almost all of the complications of the vaccines occur within weeks after getting them. We don't really see long-term side effects from vaccines, which is good news. And all the current side effects that have been rarely associated with the COVID vaccines occur quite soon after the vaccination. Now we've been following people for over a year, and they've been followed carefully on the studies, and we have not heard anything about long-term complications. And then the specific question about the lipid means fat, and so these are really harmless fat globules that are used in the vaccines just to encase that viral gene in the form of RNA. So we don't expect any harmful side effects from the lipids.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions here about the risk of blood clots and whether that was seen in any of the boosters or whether we need to be concerned about those. Dr. Marks, could you take that?
So that, in the clinical trials or in the Israel data on the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has not been raised as a concern with boosters. It's something, though, that continues to be monitored. And, we have different surveillance systems for vaccine side effects because like I said, the clinical trials, may encompass tens of thousands of patients when some rare side effects can take hundreds of thousands or even millions of patients to detect. So there's different strategies and ongoing surveillance of those by both the CDC and FDA through numerous different systems. So I don't see a reason, though, to suspect that the vaccines that didn't have weren't associated with thrombosis should, with a third dose, cause thrombosis. I mean, I don't see a biological concern necessarily, but I think the evidence so far doesn't suggest anything, but it'll continue to be monitored for.
Great, thank you. A couple questions here about whether asthma is considered a risk factor and a rationale for getting a booster. I think Trip, since obviously some of the recommendations from the CDC are, if you're moderately or severely immunocompromised, rather than listing, 100 different diseases. How do people make this judgment about whether they are, at risk and should consider getting a booster or not? And specifically about asthma in this case.
Sure. The CDC keeps a list of conditions that are risk for developing severe COVID, and that's available on their website. You can just Google CDC and risk for severe COVID, and you'll pop up that list. And the list is quite broad. It includes a number of conditions. One of them is lung disease, which actually does include asthma as being one of the conditions. Now, it's a big, long list. It doesn't really break it down by who's at the greatest risk and who's at less of a risk. And I think asthma is considered relatively less of a risk among all of the conditions which can cause a risk of more severe COVID. But nevertheless, asthma would qualify for a booster shot as well.
Right. And I think it should be pointed out that at all of the vaccine centers, certainly at our vaccine center and practices and at pharmacies, no one is digging into your medical records or testing you. This is an attestation where you believe you fit into the category of high risk or underlying disease that qualify you for a booster. So that's important to note. Thank you. A couple questions here about avoiding ibuprofen or acetaminophen either before or after you take the vaccine booster to help with side effects or symptoms. Dr. Marks, any reason to avoid either of those?
So it's not recommended to prevent symptoms, but for people who have symptoms, you can certainly take those things.
Okay. So afterwards, no issues at all with the worry about blunting the antibody response or anti-inflammatory effects after you get it. And hopefully you'll be one of those people who doesn't get any side effects or minimal side effects and you won't need it.
Correct.
Right.
I think a lot of people, the problem with taking it in sort of a preventative fashion is a lot of people wouldn't have needed it, right? So
right.
Why take something you don't need?
Yep. Great. Okay. Just looking through here. So again, obesity is a risk factor, as Dr. Gulick mentioned. That you can look at the CDC site for all of the reasons for this. So as additional questions come in, I will read them to you. I will ask a question that I have been asked. So why is it that natural disease does not confer better immunity than vaccination? Dr. Gulick, could you try answering that one?
Sure. It's what's stimulating the immune system. And it turns out that there is a certain group of people who don't develop any response at all. You might guess that having a milder illness might not be enough of a stimulus to the immune system. So people with mild COVID have occasionally been seen to have no immune response at all or no measurable antibodies. So we know now that getting the vaccine is much more of a guarantee that people will develop an immune response than simply relying on getting COVID infection. And that's the reason why, as we covered earlier, people with prior COVID still need to get the vaccines.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna guess that I will know what the answer to this question is going to be, but when will we need to get our next booster, Dr. Marks? Do we know how long immunity is, when it's going to start to wane from this booster?
No,
Okay.
not really. No. But there's ongoing studies that are looking at that. And fortunately, they're usually a little ahead of when the general population is getting a booster. So we will have the information. So you mentioned that I was running the Moderna trial here. It's ongoing and people continue to be followed, and we can turn you to learn from these clinical trials. So these participants are really providing the information that we all benefit from, and a few months prior to when we need it. So if you know anyone in a clinical trial, say thank you to them. They've committed a lot of effort and have been sort of just instrumental to giving us the knowledge we have today about how to fight COVID.
Great. And let's see, another question here about breakthrough infection, Dr. Marks. What do we know about the transmissibility of a breakthrough infection and how it compares to natural infection?
Right. So what we know is people don't shed virus for as long, and with a breakthrough infection in a vaccinated person compared to an infection in someone unvaccinated. So just based on, that knowledge, we would think there would be less transmission because they would just, not be transmitting the virus for as long of a time. So I think there's, pretty good data emerging to show that giving boosters, certainly giving the initial vaccine, but also giving boosters can help prevent transmission as well.
But we're still recommending, if you have a breakthrough infection, that you need to abide by all precautions, wear a mask, don't be in contact with others, etc. Right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Do we know, other than the 95% of patients hospitalized are unvaccinated, are there other demographics or other risk factors that we are seeing in that population that that is conferring the risk of hospitalization or severe disease? Trip, is that similar to what we've seen before?
The news media has really emphasized that it's younger people who are being seen now, but it's hard to tease that out because that's the group with the lower vaccination rates as well. Currently, elderly individuals over 65, close to 90% are vaccinated. And when you look at younger people in their 30s and 40s, it's around 50%. So that, I think, is kind of making that hard to evaluate if we're seeing differences simply because of age alone.
Yeah, okay.
We should also mention, there was just recently some data on an antiviral that's an oral antiviral that may benefit people who are at higher risk of severe disease. And I think, that'll be another level of protection that we can offer people who may have immunocompromising conditions or other reasons that if they have a breakthrough infection, they could progress to severe disease. So, kind of on top of the booster dose, which will hopefully help prevent people from getting infected at all. If someone actually gets an infection, hopefully soon we'll be able to offer an antiviral. Right now we have monoclonal antibodies available that, people with high risk conditions can access. Although if people were vaccinated, it sort of whether those would be additionally helpful was uncertain. It's kind of only if they didn't respond to the vaccine. So they work the best in people who don't already have antibodies.
And along those lines, are there any vitamin or mineral supplementations that have been shown to work or that people are recommending, Dr. Marks?
No.
Okay. Great.
Yes. I'm not against taking vitamins for people's just general health, but we don't know of any alternative ways to prevent COVID other than masks and vaccines.
Yep. Great. And Trip, the Moderna recommendation is now half a dose for the booster, whereas the Pfizer recommendation is a full dose for the booster. Can you explain why or what the difference is?
It was just based on the data available. So for Pfizer, they tested a full dose. For Moderna, they tested both the full dose and the half dose and were impressed with the results of the half dose. So that's why it made it into the recommendation.
Great. Okay. It's time for us to wrap up. So I want to thank Dr. Gulick and Dr. Marks for a terrific discussion. We've really enjoyed it, and your expertise and insights have been incredibly helpful. Even I learned a few things, which is maybe not saying a lot, but I very much appreciate it. Thank you to all of our attendees for listening and for attending and for all of your insightful questions. I hope we got to most of them, if not all of them. For more vaccine programming, the Weill Cornell Medicine Children's Health Council is holding a special event on vaccines and children later this month on October 26th. You should see a link to register on the right side of your screen, and we'll also share it via email tomorrow. The event will be hosted by Sally Permar, who is our chair of pediatrics and a renowned vaccinologist. and her research is at the forefront of the fight against COVID-19. Following her presentation, Dr. Permar will be joined by Dr. Virginia Pasquale, Director of the Drucker Institute for Children's Health, to answer attendees' questions. Thank you once again for attending this afternoon's webinar. And now I would like to turn it back over to Dean Choi for a closing message.
Thank you, Adam, and many thanks to our two panelists. We greatly appreciate your hard work and leadership as we continue our fight against this pandemic. And to all of you tuning in today, thank you. We know your time is valuable, and we're deeply grateful for all you do for Weill Cornell Medicine. If you're interested in supporting the work of Weill Cornell or learning more about any of the faculty participating on today's panel, we'll be following up with more information over email. We appreciate your interest in Weill Cornell, and we hope to be together with you in person soon. Until then, please stay safe and well.